Good morning, everyone. I welcome you back to the 2021 SNAP conference. First order of business, would like to thank our corporate sponsors, the Ribera Law Firm, the Lamoth Law Firm, and MK Safety Net for their generous support. In addition, we would also like to thank our longtime friend and supporter, Mitch Garabedian, for his generous donation of $10,000 to help defray the cost of our conference. Ann Barrett Doyle and Terry McKiernan run the website bishopaccountability.org. As an incalculable resource for survivors, advocates, and allies who are interested in learning about the clergy sexual abuse crisis. Bishopaccountability.org is a digital collection of documents, survivor witness, investigative reports, and media coverage made public to all and free of charge. Ann and Terry are constantly researching new aspects of the crisis and are key partners in the fight for justice, prevention, and accountability. Please welcome Ann and Terry.
Hello, everyone. It is so nice to be here. I really wish I could see you. My name is Ann Barrett Doyle. I'm co-director of bishopaccountability.org. Thank you, Melanie. The SNAP conference has always been the highlight of our year, and I really hope it can happen next year in person. Thanks to survivors, it's been another absolutely remarkable year in the struggle for justice in the Catholic Church. And in just a few minutes, my colleague Terry is going to give you a fast-moving overview. But first, I'm going to shine a light, or I'm going to try to, on what's changed and what hasn't in terms of holding bishops accountable for cover-up or accountable for abuse. And I'm going to start by sharing my slides here. Let's see. Share screen. All right. Let's see. I don't know why it's not moving forward. It just was. Just a moment. Okay, just a moment. I'm having some difficulties here. Let's try again. Okay, well, let's see if that works. That works, great. I think I'm good, thank you. This is ex-Cardinal Theodore McCarrick in a courtroom outside of Boston. He was answering to charges of 3 counts of indecent assault on a person under 14. He was ordered to stay away from minors, stay away from the victim, surrender his passport, and come back to court at the end of October. And then he proceeded out past a group that included clergy sexual abuse victims. That's Bob Hotzen, who was actually ordained by McCarrick. There's Steve Sheehan, who many of you know, Skip Shea, a filmmaker, an activist and survivor from Worcester, Mass. Terry and I were there too. It was such an emotional scene. It was surreal. It felt historic. We were witnessing something we could not have imagined 20 years ago. And what a mind-boggling fall from glory for Theodore McCarrick. We can't forget how powerful he was. He was a friend to popes, including the current one. McCarrick was a consummate fundraiser who generated millions of dollars for the Vatican. He hobnobbed with the most powerful people in the world. And we now know he was an insatiable predator. His victims so far that have come forward include 13 children and 9 vulnerable adults. And it was one of those victims who gets all the credit for this amazing scene, this rare triumph of justice. The Pope, McCarrick's fellow cardinals, his fellow bishops, they knew, we all knew, it was an open secret, and they did nothing. But what are the implications for this for our bigger struggle of accountability? Is the McCarrick case a trend, or is it an outlier, the exception that proves the rule? We track accused bishops worldwide, and in the United States, we count 46 US bishops accused publicly of child sexual abuse. How many do you think have been charged criminally besides McCarrick? Just one other, that is Bishop Thomas Dupre of the Springfield Mass Diocese back in 2004. And how many you think the church has held accountable or stripped in terms of stripping their title at the very least? Only McCarrick. The remaining 45, even those the church itself has deemed guilty, have been allowed to retain the title of bishop and to be called emeritus. Let's ponder that. I mean, there are few more dangerous men in our society than predatory bishops. They enable other sexual criminals, they destroy abuse files, and when a victim of a priest comes forward, the bishop doesn't call the police. He protects his priest and might even share victims with him, as McCarrick did. This ran last summer in NorthJersey.com. Ex-Cardinal Theodore McCarrick ran sex ring for clerics at New Jersey beach home, lawsuit alleges. So to answer my own question, that supernova of accountability we're seeing with McCarrick, he's the exception that proves the rule. Most offending bishops still evade justice. Here are 6 examples of living US bishops with multiple allegations. They have faced neither criminal charges nor serious sanctions from the church. Bishop Michael Bransfield of Wheeling, Charleston, West Virginia. I'm going to flip through some of these quickly. Bishop J. Keith Simons, Bishop Emeritus of St. Petersburg, Florida, who admitted to abusing 5 boys. Lawrence Sowens, Bishop Emeritus of Sioux City, Iowa. J. Kendrick Williams, Bishop Emeritus of Lexington, Kentucky. But I want to pause here, Bishop Joseph Hart. It would take me an hour to recount the lives this man has destroyed. Like Kevin Hunter's. Kevin was one of the youngest kids in a large family in the Archdiocese of Kansas City, Missouri, where Hart worked as a young priest. Kevin is 14 in this photo, and that is Father Hart's car. They were on an overnight trip to the Southwest. During this trip, Hart got Kevin drunk and sexually assaulted him. Kevin's life spun out of control. He died at age 32 of AIDS, and 2 of his brothers were also abused by Hart. Hart had been like a member of their family. In all, 18 victims have come forward to say that Joseph Hart abused them. Bishops in 2 dioceses say that the allegations are credible. The police in Cheyenne investigated and found substantial evidence, yet the prosecutor chose not to criminally charge him. And in this reason, the reason appears to be not a failure of law, but a colossal failure of will on the prosecutor's part. And the church made a decision too. In January, we heard the results of their canonical investigation. Vatican clears retired US bishop of multiple abuse claims. They found him not guilty on all counts. It was a devastating outcome. It's worth going into some detail about what they said because it tells us so much about the tilt of canon law. The Vatican considered the cases of 14 of Hart's victims. They exonerated Bishop Hart in 7 of those cases. They ruled that his guilt in 5 others couldn't be proved with, quote, moral certitude. And they threw out 2 other cases involving boys ages 16 and 17 because at the time they were assaulted in the Catholic Church didn't consider them minors. I detailed, in fact, in the end, all he received was a canonical rebuke that chided him for, quote, a flagrant lack of prudence. He has a few restrictions on his ministry, but he remains a bishop emeritus, free and comfortable in a way his victims never will be. I detail this because it really illustrates the deep inbuilt bias of canon law. It is not a justice system, it is a priest preservation system. Howard Hubbard, Bishop Emeritus of Albany, New York. He faced 2 allegations in the early 2000s, so he did what bishops still often do, which is to hire an outside investigator who, sure enough, issued a report that cleared him. The controversy disappeared. He served out a really comfortable term as Albany, New York bishop for another 10 years, finally retiring in 2014 at the age of 76. But then in 2019, Child Victims Act revival window opened in New York. 7 additional victims have named Hubbard as a child molester. 5 of them say that he abused them in concert with other priests. And it was the filing of that last lawsuit that finally prompted a public announcement by the church that Hubbard is under an internal investigation according to the process spelled out in Vos Estis Lux Mundi, You Are the Light of the World. I am not going to go into detail this time about what all of its provisions, but it has 2 parts. It requires every religious and cleric to report sexual abuse to their superiors, and it spells out procedures for how bishops accused of either abuse or cover-up should be reported and investigated. And for today, it's the second part that's relevant to what I'm talking about. The gist is that it's a plan of self-policing. Bishops, for the most part, the local archbishops, investigate their fellow bishops who are not only their colleagues, but their neighbors and often their friends. And what has been its impact so far? Well, 2 Vos Estis cases were resolved this year. One was with Bishop Michael Heppner, Bishop of Crookston, Minnesota, from 2007 to 2021. And in April, Heppner became the first US bishop to be sanctioned by the church under Vos Estis Lux Mundi. Just to be clear, he was accused of cover-up, not abuse. Pope asked US bishop to resign after cover-up investigation. On the face of it, you might say, good for Pope Francis. A bishop obstructed justice and the Pope forced him out. But when you consider what Heppner did, that penalty, an early retirement to the Sun Belt, seems lenient. In depositions in a civil case, Heppner admitted to mishandling the cases of several accused priests. For instance, he told the Archdiocese of St. Paul in Minneapolis that his former vicar general, Monsignor Roger Grundhaus, was fit for ministry, even though Heppner knew that Grundhaus had been accused of abusing a 16-year-old boy in the early 1970s. The victim, Ron Vasek, later sued the Crookston Diocese, alleging that Heppner blackmailed him into retracting his allegations against Grundhaus. Here's the letter that Ron was forced to sign by Heppner. He did so because Heppner had a lot of power over him. Ron's son was a priest in Crookston, and Ron himself was an aspiring deacon. Given this grotesque abuse of power, forcing a victim to recant his allegation, giving him an early retirement, Heppner an early retirement, seems woefully inadequate. Excuse me. Another Vos Estis case was resolved at the beginning of this month. Vatican clears Brooklyn bishop of child abuse charges from 1970s. Bishop Nicholas DiMarzio still faces 2 lawsuits based on the allegations, which date to his time as a young priest in Jersey City. Bishop DiMarzio maintains his innocence, and we don't know much about the allegations except what has appeared in the newspapers thanks to the civil suits. But what's important here is that he was investigated by his neighbor, Cardinal Dolan, his archbishop, his metropolitan archbishop in New York. And Cardinal Dolan showed a blatant partiality towards towards DiMarzio. In a January 2020 podcast, he talked about his new assignment to investigate DiMarzio, and Dolan said, I love the guy. He's a good friend. He's never had an accusation against him in his whole life. But in November, somebody made an accusation from way back, 48 years ago or so. And as much as Bishop DiMarzio said, this is ridiculous, this is unjust, darn it, we just have to take it seriously. Obviously, Dolan should have recused himself. He had an obvious conflict of interest, but his excuse was, my investigators were objective. Lay investigators are not independent. They are hired hands. They are sworn to confidentiality. They don't know what they don't know. They don't know what files they're giving access to. Also, DiMarzio remained in office during the investigation. Vos Estis allows bishops to do that, and this inevitably biased the process. The Pope was signaling that DiMarzio remained in his good graces, and you can imagine the chilling effect that would have had on witnesses, not to mention the ability of the investigators to access files from the Brooklyn Diocese. And the process is secretive. After 20 months of silence, all we got was a 3-paragraph statement from the Archdiocese of New York, leaving lots of questions unanswered. For one thing, if this is such an open and shut case, why did it take so long to resolve? The investigators' full report, as well as Dolan's votum, that's the judgment and documents that he sent to the Vatican, should be made public. This case reflects the inadequacy of Vos Estis. Consider the choices Pope Francis made when he crafted it. He prioritized insularity and containment. He kept the hierarchy in total control of the investigative process. He limited lay involvement to roles that are fragmented, powerless, and almost certainly bound by confidentiality. He chose not to require notifying civil authorities, and he chose to omit transparency. Vos Estis includes no requirement to notify the public. Is this to say Vos Estis is worthless? Absolutely not. While it's a biased process and the penalties it doles out are just slaps on the wrist so far, at least it's removing some bad bishops from office. And just the fact that it exists is staggering. I mean, consider what survivors have accomplished in the last 3 years. You caused this historic meeting to happen. This was the summit in Rome in 2019. Bishops from all over the world gathered to talk about abuse. Through your activism and courage, you forced the Pope himself to talk about bishop accountability. And admittedly, while my expectations have been low for Vos Estis and remain so, more bishops than I expected have been removed. Something absolutely remarkable is happening in Poland. This sign says, "Bishop hiding pedophilia is a crime." There's been a tremendous shakeup in that country. Pope cleans house in Poland after abuse cover-up scandal. Many victims have come forward. The Supreme Court has ruled that the church is liable for clergy sexual abuse. There's a state investigation into the Catholic Church. And as a result of all this activism and response by civil authorities, many Polish bishops have been removed. I'm going to flip past this one here. Here we go. These are some of the Polish bishops who are under investigation by the Vatican. And the US hierarchy is undergoing some shakeup as well. I mean, this is all compared to the very low bar of a few years ago, but still a surprising number have been under investigation in the last 3 years. Many of these cases are still ongoing. These are bishops accused of either abuse or cover-up. Most important is that you've caused this movement to go global. This is the scene in Ireland back in 2018, in Argentina, in Spain, in Germany earlier this year. India, these are people protesting on a bishop who's accused of raping, on trial right now, actually, for raping a nun. I'm going to stop my share. Doris Reisinger ended her excellent talk with a call to action. Got me thinking, if I were going to pinpoint one action that I think would be the best use of people's time to work on, there's no doubt that it would be getting your state to pass a revival window to revive expired civil claims. As you know, the New York window just closed in August 2019, and it's utterly transformed our understanding of what went on in those dioceses. In Buffalo alone, back in 2004, the bishop there said he had only 67 allegations against priests, and that's been tripled by what's come out in the Child Victims Act. I am now going to turn this over to my wonderful colleague, Terry McCarrick, who's going to show you some more highlights of this remarkable year. Thank you.
Thanks, Anne, and hi, everyone. What an amazing presentation, as usual, so deep and so broad as this quote unquote crisis has become. And it's become that way because of you. As Anne said at the beginning of her talk, we are so honored to be here. We look forward to being in Denver in person next year, fingers crossed. And as we say every year, it's true every year, everything that we document, the entire library that we put together, exists because of you. Not a single document in the whole collection would be there but for the courage of a survivor. So I thank you so much for that. I'm going to screen share here and get started on my presentation too. This is Anne at the demonstration at the McCarrick arraignment. In full teaching mode, helping reporters and everyone who will listen understand that McCarrick is not an isolated case. I'm not going to talk a lot about bishops because she's covered that, but you can go to this amazing page that she has put together and go through all of the changes that have happened in bishop accountability over the last year. I did my usual review of all of the news reports from the last year, thousands and thousands of them. And this is an impressionistic selection of them. We'll post all the links online in the next week so that if some of what I talk about interests you, you can always follow up. Some of them will be familiar to you, perhaps some of them not. I think they fall into maybe 4 categories. It does seem to me that we're on the verge of a real revolution that comes from the Me Too movement and the Nuns Too movement. And that'll come out in the slides ahead. As Anne said, SOL reform is really revolutionizing things, and I think that will continue. Investigations, both by criminal prosecutors and by investigative reporters, are continuing to transform what we know about the crisis. And in particular, I think Native abuse and the Catholic Church's role in that will come to the fore. And in all of these 4 areas, it's survivors who are driving the change. First of all, just a quick look at people who have passed away in the last year. They are no longer a danger to children, as attorney Mitch Garabedian has said. And we also, I think, see their stories in as a whole, with a beginning, a middle, and an end, when someone like Paul Shanley or Karadima, Richard Levine in Massachusetts pass away. Now, I'm not putting attorney Saratella in that category. He got a lot of praise when he passed away this past year. I would remind people, though, that Jason Berry takes a harsher view of him in his first book, and that's worth remembering. There have been some amazing books to come out in the last year. Probably the most scholarly and most amazing, I've only read parts of it, is The Corrupter of Boys, who takes what we are working on and reads it back into the Middle Ages in a very destabilizing way. This is a book that Tom Doyle really thinks is fantastic. James Carroll's memoir by Gabriel Byrne, Cardinal Pell's Prison Journal, whatever you think of Pell, it's a significant document and will continue to be, certainly. And an amazing study by Doris Reisinger and a colleague of what they call the Ratzinger system. And that's in German. We'll come out with translations of some pieces of it, and I hope that it's translated in full. It's an amazing study of the documents and what they say about Cardinal Ratzinger, Pope Benedict. People are really at the heart of what we all do. And I'd like to flag some profiles that I think are really terrific from the last year. Coincidentally, a half an hour before Anne and I went on, an old friend of mine, Richard Jangula, called me up. This is a profile and an amazing interview with him. He came forward about Father Pateco 10 years ago. Richard is now entirely blind, lots of health difficulties, an absolutely courageous person, a key person, and this is a beautiful profile of him. This is a very, very impactful profile by Jenny Grossmanner of her husband, Peter, who was abused by Donald Malone. This Sinead O'Connor profile, remember her tearing up that photograph years ago, is really quite remarkable. Murray Sinclair is the attorney, Native American senator who is really behind the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada. And he's also, as a result, behind what's going to be happening in the United States about Native abuse. This profile of my colleague Anne is really wonderful. You've probably all seen it, but I recommend it if you haven't. This is a great profile of Bob Hotzen, who is, what a remarkable person Bob is. And I remember the Gary McCarrick trial that I went to in Western Mass, this is years ago, and there was Bob supporting the survivors in that. His kind of two-fisted sign style is visible, as Ann pointed out, also in the arraignment of Cardinal McCarrick, is the person who ordained Bob. Bob does amazing work, as we all know. This profile of Maura O'Donoghue is really worth reading, and it has in it, in our version here, links to some of the documents that Doris Reisinger mentioned during her talk on Friday. This is a great, very brief video, for those of you who haven't seen it, about Jason Berry and his crucial work at the beginning and ongoing in the abuse crisis. It's in the Almost Famous series, but of course for us, Jason is extremely famous and certainly deserves to be. And this is a really terrific profile of Kisha Supernant, who's the Native American archaeologist whose expertise in ground penetrating radar is behind a lot of the terrible discoveries that are being made in Canada right now and will be made in the United States. Now, you folks are really the key to the activism of the crisis. There are other amazing friends and colleagues also at work. Sally's presentation on Friday was a real revelation for me. I learned so much from it, and I admire so much her building this new movement really from the ground up and having such success. The people at Intermount for their work on David Haas and others are really to be commended. Their focus on survivor witness and their success in making sure that people know what David Haas was up to. Absolutely amazing work. Investigation in Wisconsin by the Attorney General is really a remarkable achievement. And it's an achievement that comes from Peter Isley, from Karen Lindstrom, whose husband was abused and who struggled for years to cope with how the Norbertines were treating him, Sarah Larson at Awake Milwaukee, and Patty Marchant, therapist and survivor, very active in this amazing achievement in Milwaukee and in Wisconsin generally. Behind so much of the advances in SOL is the work of Child USA, of course. Now let's talk about SOL Windows for a second and how they've turned the whole thing up and down, really. This is Child USA's map of activity just in the last year legislative when it comes to statute of limitations reform. In New York, 10,857 cases were filed. It is an absolutely mind-boggling achievement and a huge advance in what we know about this in New York. And our colleague Steve Sheehan has been collecting every single one of those complaints so we can put them online. You couldn't, if we had all day, go through the stories that have been generated from the window in New York, like this one here. And they've really revolutionized the work that our colleague Susie Nauman is doing on our database in its new format here, incorporating so many newly accused persons in New York and other places with windows. Not just New York, of course. This report in New Jersey from the veteran reporter Abbott Koloff and his colleague Dina Yellen included a database they put together of the complaints that had come out up to that time in Jersey. Great investigative journalism too, and I'll go quickly through these. I think probably the prize winner, the Nobel Prize winner, the Pulitzer Prize winner for this year, as far as I'm concerned, is Robert Herguth at the Sun-Times in Chicago. Fantastic reporting, in depth, and so many reports in the last year. This is an amazing series on the Basilian Order of Priests in Toronto and Canada by Adrian Gabriel. They also did a video that you see here. This report by Chico Harlan and Stefano Petrelli about that case of a seminary in the Vatican is really transformed something from a trial we weren't really sure we could even take seriously to a very, very important story in the abuse crisis. The story about Bobby Bizzip, the boy who disappeared in Colorado. Accused priests are certainly suspects in that crime. Is amazing. This report from the Global Sisters Project, very courageous for them, on victims of religious sisters. And the reports that have swirled around Sister Lucy Kalapura, one of the nuns in Kerala, who has pressed for the arrest of Bishop Franco, who is now on trial. She has suffered retribution, both from the Vatican and locally, and a court, actually, in India, ordered the Catholic Church to continue to house her in the convent. They had tried to expel her, basically, out on the street. This is an example of the stories of abuse of nuns that Doris Reisinger urged us to keep front and center if we can. Nate Lindstrom's story in this Green Bay Press Gazette feature is very, very important to read. Sherry Diazin out in the Springfield Diocese in Massachusetts had this 3-part series written about her, very, very moving and very important because her case got lost, sidelined, whatever it was that happened. There are documents in the story as well. On Friday night, I was dismayed to discover that some news reports on Irish radio had disappeared from the internet, but I managed to record one that was still available. And it's a very unusual investigative report because it's a radio show where the radio host is actually reading portions of a report that the Jesuits had commissioned but failed to release in Ireland about one of the most terrible offenders there, Joseph Marmion. But the two main subjects of investigative reporting, of course, are the terrible events in Kamloops and in Native Indigenous schools generally in Canada. This is the first announcement of that by the tribe itself. That's Kamloops. These are boys, let's face it, being forced to pray in all likelihood in an Indigenous school in Canada. And I think that we need to be mindful as we go through this, and we're going to be focusing on this for a long time, that spiritual abuse is really an issue here, as well as physical abuse and the forced destruction of these children's culture. This is coming to the United States thanks to Deb Haaland, who has commissioned a federal Indian boarding school initiative in this memo. Plenty of reports, the McCarrick report, limited but very valuable. People are going to connect it with Pillar's revelations about Burrell. I'm not going to get into that very, very complicated case, except to say that I know gay Catholics who have been just thrown into a tailspin by all of the conflict about the story. I think what will probably happen is that we'll focus, as Anne was doing, on the other 45, especially as the trial of McCarrick approaches. This Colorado report and the revelations about Father Woody, so-called, this New Zealand report, the mother and baby homes, enormous report out of Ireland. this German report about the Diocese of Cologne. Now, there are plenty of video and podcasts, and I'm going to get into those in what we post, but I'll just use this as a placeholder, a remarkable report on Mother Teresa's sisters and those who really felt they needed to leave. So that's a quick summary of some of the stories from the last year, some of the advances that are really due to your amazing work. And I do think they probably fall into these 4 categories for the most part. I'm going to stop sharing now. And we're looking forward to answering any questions you might have. And many, many thanks to Snap, to Zach, to his team for your hospitality again this year. Thanks so much.
Okay. Do you want to unmute, Anne? And wonderful, as usual, presentation. I want to just say that I'm doing this so I get the first sort of comment, is that I loved Anne's the priest preservation system. I really like that. Okay, we have a couple of questions. The first one that I'll do is, Terry, they wanted to know how to find the reports that you were talking about. Are you going to have a list on BA someplace?
Yes, this is, that presentation comes out of a 25-page document that I put together of all of those stories, reports, and so forth, and some others as well. And this afternoon, I'll start creating a web document with all of them. And by the end of the week, that will be up, and we'll announce that it's ready by posting the announcement on Abuse Tracker.
Great. Secondly, someone wanted to know, or Anne wanted to know, will you be, if you could talk a little bit about what you see as the impact of Pope Francis on the pontifical secret and canon law?
Well, the jury is still very much out on that. We have not heard, I can't think of one instance off the top of my head where the Pope's lifting of the pontifical secret in regards to sex abuse cases has actually resulted in files being turned over to prosecutors, since that was passed in December 2019. It was touted by Archbishop Scicluna as the height of transparency, but in fact, all it did was tell bishops that they don't have to obstruct justice if they are under a prosecutor's order to turn over documents. They can waive the pontifical secret and do so. It has not transformed the Catholic Church in terms of its willingness to release information generally. It's a very specific, narrow application. So it certainly needed to be done, but it was very much in the interests of the Catholic Church to do it because prosecutors are no longer tolerating willful cover-up and withholding of documents.
I'd add that it might also be resulting in a slightly less abusive situation as far as the survivors are concerned. Back in the 70s, when Mr. Boland was grilled by the church in the Brendan Smith matter, that was, in my view, re-victimizing and re-abusing him. I sense that James Grine had a better experience when he testified about McCarrick during that investigation. But I absolutely agree with Anne that it's hard to see whether there are really any advantages and results coming out of this beyond that.
Okay, and this is, Deb wants to know if one can still look up individual priests on your website, because it's different than it was before a little bit.
Yes, absolutely. So there are actually, if you click on the database block on the homepage, you're brought to the sort of main search page. And you can actually search names in two ways. The name itself, which will bring up anyone with that last name, or the name as it appears in the database, which will bring up if an offender is mentioned in someone else's description, it will also bring up that description. So I think that will actually make it, there are more ways of looking for individual priests. But please, if Deb has, continues to have issues or questions about how to use the database, it's definitely a work in progress for us. We think it's better already, but it's going to be getting even better than it is. And we'd appreciate any guidance from Deb or anyone else who's interested in giving us feedback about how to make the better database better.
And Melanie, I just want to jump in too, just to say that, as Terry said, every single name in that database is because a victim came forward. But a measure of what survivors have accomplished in the last 3 years and of what our colleague Susie Nauman has accomplished is that 3,000 names have been added to the database in the last 3 years. I mean, that is a measure of incredible disclosure. And Susie works so hard, she has carpal tunnel. And so it's just, I want to thank everybody and especially do a shout out to Susie, who is our database manager.
Yeah. And even the names in the database now that come from the bishop's own disclosures, as was the case, for example, in Seattle, a couple of dozen people we didn't know about were revealed in one of their lists, and Susie was able to put them in the database as a result. Let's remember that those names too originated in survivors coming forward and survivors having courage. And so it's all because of you.
We've had a couple different questions regarding the abuse of adults in the Catholic Church. And I know the Vatican law is supposed to change in December regarding the abuse of adults. So I guess there's a few ideas. One is Bishop Accountability going to start including these adult abusers on their website? And do you think we're making progress in this? And let's say, as I said, there's a couple of questions and they keep moving. How many abusers are still concealed, do you think, because they abuse people who were over the age? In California, I think at least the one diocese included under 25, but not over 25, Sacramento.
Yeah, I have a few brief remarks. I think, Anne, you've been working very closely with an adult survivor recently, and I'm sure you'll have comments as well. We do recognize that that our policy in the database of limiting the database to persons who have abused persons under the age of 18 isn't adequate to the situation. Where we have come down so far in our conversations, and we've been talking about this intensively, is that we probably want to keep the separation, but fix the problem. So we're developing a page which will really foreground those cases and provide a way for people to find them. We don't think at the moment we have the staff to do a complete database of everyone. We don't even really know what the size of that universe is, but we know it's very large. But we're going to make a start, and we in no way want it to seem like we're sending the message that an adult survivor's abuse is less important, that it matters. It absolutely matters as much, and we care about it, and we want to do a better job of representing it.
Yeah, I just want to say, sorry, I'm acting a little funky here. Sorry. I just want to say that Dorothy Small has a note in the chat. Can you hear me, Terry?
Oh, yes, I can.
Oh, sorry. Has a note in the chat that she was banned from ministry for reporting her abuser, but her abuser was not. It is insane what is happening with adult victims and with abusers of adult victims. The church, in regards to abusers of adult victims, is acting exactly the way they did, even in the United States, with in terms of cover up and reinstating these priests and not levying serious penalties as they did 20, 30, 40 years ago. And it is an absolute outrage and scandal. And we are hearing from more and more adult survivors. This does not answer that really good question, but as Terry said, we know we have to start documenting this, and it's really high on our priority list. And, you know, honestly, I want to say to Dorothy and others, you know, keep our feet to the fire on this.
Yeah. And I'd add that, you know, the SIPE movie and the panel that we did last night with Joe and Tom, this is a problem. This is an issue close to Richard Sipe's heart as well. You know, this terrible, terrible problem is bigger than any of these subdivisions that we might make in it. And I thank goodness people are really beginning to pay attention to it now, and we will.
Okay, this is a question from Carolyn. She was raised in a Catholic orphanage in Cleveland, Ohio. So there was lots of abuse there. And she wondered if you could tell her whether she and the other people that were abused should be going to the media for a news story.
Can I like that, Terry, only because I have a special interest in Cleveland. My husband grew up there and went to a Catholic school, and it's been like a second home to me. And basically the Ohio diocese are getting away with total cover-up. I actually planned for personal reasons because a friend was abused by a priest that still hasn't been sufficiently exposed. I am going to go to Cleveland sometime this fall and do a press conference about this. And Carolyn, I would love it if you would get in touch with me. Perhaps we can meet up there. You know, the more people and more information we have, the more impactful it will be. So I'm going to, you can contact me and Terry and Susie at staff@bishop-accountability.org.
Okay, let's see. Question from Judy. Do you have any suggestions for how legislators can get laws rescinding the secrecy of the confessional when a penitent admits to abusing children? There's a Utah legislator that wants to get a law like that passed.
The sacrament of confession is so important in all of this. And we are actually working on a project to get a collection of information out about the sacrament of penance, and also to do interviews with survivors who have been abused in the sacrament of penance, or for whom the sacrament of penance figured in some way in their abuse. The place where dealing with the seal has gone farthest has been in Australia. And the Australian Royal Commission reports have some very valuable information about confession and the seal. That's certainly one place to start. I think it's a heavy lift because it's still, I think, in the United States is almost, well, it is literally a matter of dogma that that the seal is inviolable. One thing that I discovered in working on the Australian cases is that the people who most noticeably break the seal are priests themselves. There are quite a number of abuse cases in Australia in which someone reported their abuse in confession and the confessor abused them in turn, or reported back to the abuser that he had heard about the abuse, and the child was then brutally beaten or even anally raped as punishment once the original abuser learned of it. And I think that these terrible cases are probably valuable as people scrutinize the seal and see what it really is and whether it really has the value that people claim. Jim Connell up in Milwaukee has, I believe, written some very insightful things about the seal of confession and whether it really is as important as the Catholic Church thinks and claims. That's a rather wandering answer, but I would love, please get in touch with me. I would love to continue this conversation, and reporting of abuse is such an important issue. So I thank you for raising it.
This is a question from Bobby. Can you offer any advice to survivor activists of other churches? And he was, I guess, specifically thinking of the Southern Baptists that would like to build a network and database of abusers, facilitators, such as Bishop Accountability. And I believe there is Baptist Accountability. I can't remember whether it's what the exact thing is, but I'm sure if you look that up, you will find some information. Anyway.
We would love to talk about, our experience and, maybe somewhat different from what Bobby is planning. And you and I have certainly done that in the past with people who have been interested in not reinventing the wheel. There's no need to do that. And as we saw in Sally's presentation on Friday, there's so much good example out there, not only at BA, I hope, but especially at SNAP. You folks are the masters of this activism, and I'm sure you can help as well.
I think so I'm glad someone posted the link for Baptist Accountability. And we had a question from Steve as to whether you're following the redress schemes that have popped up over the world, particularly maybe the one in Australia, which has not been well received by the survivors down there.
Yeah, we are following them, and that's a particularly underwhelming example. And there's been some shocking reporting about the redress schemes in Ireland in the wake of the Ryan report. Shortly before the Ryan report on industrial schools was released in Ireland in 2009, I believe. All sorts of shell games were played with money. Money was moved into trusts, and the promised amount has not been delivered after all of those terrible offenses that the Ryan report documents. So this is a real problem. Talking the talk but not walking the walk, and we are following those developments closely.
Melanie, can I just jump in? I know we're right at the deadline. Are we going dark at 1 o'clock?
I believe so.
Okay, because Trish Cahill has asked a couple of questions, maybe in the chat, about nuns, about when are we gonna, I think the gist of it is, are we gonna do a better job kind of profiling and amplifying abuse of nuns on our website? Terry, do you wanna answer that until you're cut off?
Yes, absolutely. And one way that we can do that is that some of these nuns, including one in particular I remember from the Helena list, are very, very kind of lavishly profiled over the years in local papers. And we've gotten access to some of those papers and we'll be improving the descriptions. It's always tough with religious order people. The Catholic Directory doesn't provide the information we need to assemble career histories. But I agree we can do better, and we're in the midst of doing that. So thanks for the encouragement, but as Ann says, please keep our feet to the fire.
Well, I want to thank both of you for being with us again this year, and wonderful presentation and wonderful database. I use
Thank
it
you,
all the
Melanie.
time.
It makes
Thank you,
us feel
Melanie.
good. Thank you.
Thanks for your hospitality, Snap.
Thank you, Snap. Thanks, everybody, for your comments and questions.